by talking about beauty, because the concept of beauty is one of the most confusing concepts existing in the Western culture. As a matter of fact, when you don't have the same words to be divided between different languages, normally that means that the different languages have a different concept of the same idea. Let's talk very easily. There's only one word which unifies all the languages of Europe. And that word is what? It is wine. Wine, vino, vin, wine, is the same word even in Russian, for a very simple reason. We are all using the same wine because we have all the same Christian origin. You cannot be a Christian without wine. You cannot be a Western European without wine. So wine is unifying Europe. Go over to the concept of beauty. It's much more difficult because you have an Italian word, which is a bello, but which did not exist in Latin times, which is not connected to the concept of kalos, the Greek one, which is a complete different word, which has nothing to do with the German word, which is schön. What has schön to do with the idea of kalos or of pulcher, of pulcher. But is pulcher the idea of beauty? I do remember that years ago, there was a great confusion about using a quotation of Dostoevsky in which the Prince Mishkin in the Iliad of Dostoevsky ends his story saying beauty is going to save the world. But he says beauty in Russian, he says krasnie. And krasnie in Russian is not exactly what we say is beauty, but he uses a concept of Saint Augustinus, the famous baptized in Milan and bishop of Carthago. And what does Saint Augustinus say about it? He says it very simply. He says, pulcritudo Dei salvatio mundi. Pulcritudo is a very unexpected concept, because if it happens to you to meet one of your Roman colleagues of the 1st century after Christ, I imagine that one of those legionary Romans, militaries like you, and you say him that he's pulcher, he would not react in a very friendly way, because pulcher is not adapted to a legionario. The legionario is formosus, which means it's muscled, and the Spanish word for beauty for man is still today hermoso, which comes from formosus. If you could say pulcra only to a puella, that means much more. That means that the declaration of pulcritudo Dei is the first characteristic of being a puella, which is not beauty, which is grazia. It is the grazia, it is the graceful, it is grace that makes the salvation of the world. It is the grace of God which saves the world. And that means that brings us back to as you began quoting Greek philosophy. In Greek philosophy, one of the basic moments of what we are today is Pythagoras. Pythagoras, at the beginning of the between 7th and 6th century, invents a series of words that we are still using. Cosmos, we didn't know the cosmos before. Words which are mathemas, those who know things, which are initiated to the mysteries, and a wonderful word which is harmonia. The first time that a value is brought out, it is not a value of beautiness or beautifulness, it is a value of harmony. What is the value of harmony? It is the relation, it is a good relation between the dimensions of numbers, relation between 3 and 4, relation between 1 and 2, between 1 and 5, everything staying in the 4 first numbers which may form the tetractys, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In that relation stays harmony. Now, why did I quote you this funny question about harmony? Because we cannot understand the idea of cultural heritage without having the possibility of using harmony as a sort of a key to enter the question. What would I mean with this abstract, curious concept? If we use the concept of beauty, everyone has his own idea of beauty, you know. And the point that in Italy, the concept of beauty and the concept of good is almost close one to the other. It's very close to the concept of Greek kalos, where kalos was called kalos kai agathos. Something is beautiful because it is useful. And we say in Italy today, because we are very evolved and we are very philosophical, we say, for instance, un bel piatto di spaghetti, a pretty dish of spaghetti, which is a concept of beauty that has nothing to do with the old other concept of grazia. So now, if we don't use anymore the idea of beauty, and we use the other concept, the concept of harmony, then it becomes much more easier to analyze and to try to understand what the Italian cultural heritage is. Point one. Point two. 100 years ago, Italy was the first tourist country worldwide. Now we are number 9, because the remaining part of the world evolved. But 100 years ago, we were the prettiest country in the world, and we were one of the poorest countries in Europe. Today, we are a rather wealthy country, but we are much less beautiful than we used to be 100 years ago. So what is the omen that we could imagine? To remain in a certain way easygoing economically and turn to be a bit more elegant and more beautiful than we are today. We destroyed part of the country, but we still have very much. Now, at the beginning of the last century, the general quotation was to consider, it is not the right quotation, but it was a sort of a dramatic, very dramatic declaration that 60% of the worldwide cultural heritage was in Italy. Is that true or not? By that time, it seemed to be true, because with a painting, a Sinise painting of a follower of Duccio di Boninsegna, you would get by that time 5 paintings by Monet. Today, with one painting of Monet, you can get 35 followers of Duccio da Boninsegna, which means that the appreciation worldwide of the values have been totally changing. By that time, the antiquity is very, very important, but by that time, we didn't yet have the Metropolitan Museum in New York as the building of today. We didn't have the Guggenheim. We didn't have the Calatrava buildings. We didn't know about the Taj Mahal in India. We didn't know about the pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico. The idea of cultural heritage was very closer to the idea of good collector in a decent European museum. Sorry, cultural heritage was considered principally by what was libraries, paintings, sculpture, and treasures. All the great idea of heritage, buildings, traditions, were considered as a second part. Not only the idea of was split in two different ways of conceiving it. On one side, heritage, on the other side, legacy. What is the difference between heritage and legacy? Heritage is what we can touch, the buildings, the objects, that is the heritage. The legacy is a bit more. Heritage is the building of the Scala, of the theater of the Scala. Legacy is the capacity to have musicians playing and singing in that theater. The difference between legacy and heritage is fundamental to make to reason about what generally is conceived today as cultural heritage. So that brings us to a major point in Italy. As a matter of fact, anyhow, even if we destroyed a lot, even if we killed the harmony, we are still considered what to be one of the central points of cultural heritage worldwide. UNESCO has Italy as the country with the highest number of UNESCO places. And as UNESCO is placed in Paris, and as we all know, that France looks over Italy with a certain sense of suffisance. It is very funny to know that we have much more UNESCO places in Italy than France or Germany put together. Why do we have so many places? Have we been producing more? In a certain way, yes. We have a history which begins, if we go around, in the 7th century before Christ, and you can go to the Vestigia. We can go to see places in Sardinia or in Tuscany where the Mura Pelasgiche, the civilizations of the sea people, are still touchable. We have the Greek inheritance. We have more Greek temples than Greece has. We have the Roman heritage. We have wonderful medieval heritage. We have that magic moment in which, after Constantinus, we throw away the old temples and we transform them into first churches. And then we have another unexpected phenomenon, which is this great rebus, which is Italy. As a matter of fact, we are united since more or less 150, 160 years. But before that time, the country which has been united was organized in 7 different states: the Republic of Venezia, the Ducado of Milan, the Pope country, the Regno delle Due Sicilie, Genova, Piedmont, and so on. They were 7 countries, each of which was in a certain way richer in heritage and quality of objects than entire countries. The King of France at the end of the 15th century, now after that he changed direction, but at the end of the 15th century, the King of France had a library which was a little library put into confrontation with the library of Sigismondo Malatesta, with the library of Cesena, with a collection of books of Firenze. The complexity of Italy is the key of its wealth. It is the great difference between the sea world of Venice, the sea world of the Aragons in Trapani, the sea world in Genova, the Repubbliche Marinare on one side, the great banking societies of Milan, of Firenze in the Middle Ages, which makes a difference with the remaining part of Europe, and which gives a help to the complexity of the country. Now, the first point that I would like really to remember is this unbelievable complexity of Italy. Then there are 2 other points. You see, we are the descendants of what is called the Controriforma, the curious relation between power, church, and people, which has been the answer to the Reformation of Luther in Germany. What is the meaning of the Controriforma? It is a great social pact. The Signor Conte, the Count, hasn't to be exaggerated with his country people. The bourgeois has to behave decently. Even the priest can have a perpetua, the lady living with him, but she has at least to have for 40 years in order not to end up with little children as children of the village priest. It is that social pact which brought Italy to an unexpected milestone. We have been puñaces como las abejas, as Ortega y Gasset says about Europe. We were one against the other like bees for the whole Middle Ages up to the mid of the 16th century. The pact that Italy made in the mid of the 15th century had an unbelievable effect. For 400 years, which means from the end of the last expedition of Charles V in Siena and Florence at the mid of the century, of the 16th century, and World War II, as a matter of fact, if we, for the exception of the Guerra d'Indipendenza, for the exception of the expedition of Napoleon, Italy has not been seeing wars as important as the remaining part of Europe. Germany, more or less, committed suicide in the War of the 30 Years. France, with a great dream of grandeur of Louis XIV, decided to destroy all the castles which were the castles of the nobility, to transform them in residences or in luxury places. We have, if we go up to our mountains, we go up to Tirolo, we go up to Piemonte, we remain in central Italy, we still have the castles of the 12th century, 13th century. We are the only ones in Europe. We and the Spaniards. Spain has in a certain part of the country the same sort of quality inherited. So the first point to understand why Italy has such an unbelievable legacy and heritage is related to the fact that we have been the place of peace. We could be an example for the world. We have been, if it happens to me when I'm driving from Firenze to Siena, 55 kilometers, you cross a place which is called Montaperti. The Battle of Montaperti in the 12th century, in 13th century, was like the Battle of Verdun at the beginning in World War I. A great dramatic conflict between two different ideas of politics, between two different nations, Firenze on one side, Siena on the other, and with a number of dead people related to the real population, which is close to what happened in World War I. Now you drive from Firenze to Siena, you get a coffee, you get your aperitivo in Firenze, and you go for lunch in Siena. Italy has a wonderful secret. It has been the first laboratory of peace in Europe. It is the only place, and that is why the heritage and the legacy of Italy are so interesting. And that is what we take with us. We go back to the affresco of the Buongoverno in Siena, the one of Ambrogio Lorenzetti, where we have a distribution, which is, again, can we call it beautiful? No, certainly not. You have on one side, you have a town. And around the town, you have the walls closing the town. Inside the town, the people are pressed one against the other, and they are constantly working to build up a town which has to be bigger and bigger constantly. The towers are one against the other. You can understand that there is a mixture between military life, commercial life, political life, and personal life. Then you go out of the door of the city and you enter a landscape which is perfectly in harmony, which is not nature, as my friend Daniel Spöri used to say. Nature is not naturally beautiful. Nature is full of flies, of dangerous animals, of bears. Nature is against it. Today we consider nature the utmost of relation, of ecological relation. For the Middle-aged people, nature was a country. Italy was the first country to dominate integrally its nature. You have on one side the city in Ambrogio Lorenzetti, on the other side you have this wonderful harmony of the landscape, this wonderful harmony of the work in the campi, those who are planting, those who are sewing, those who are growing vineyards, and that is the image of a theoretically perfect country. And that is the image that we still have in our minds, the image that has been transported worldwide, the image was converted great part of Britain to end up in Italy, in Firenze in the 19th century. It's the image that we tremended, and that in a certain way was accepted by the upper classes, by the upper middle classes. lower classes in Italy had a life which was much less exciting, which has been in a certain way saved by the transformation of the 20th century. So today, our legacy is a different question. We have a legacy which is historical, we have a legacy which is cultural, but that legacy is not very well known. And then there's another point. My dear friend Antonio Paolucci, who directed for a long time the museums of Firenze, and after that the Uffizi, and after that the Museum of the Vatican, we used to talk together about an idea which was the idea of the Museo Diffuso. That idea came when we went, we surveyed the Uffizi. Can you imagine a summer day in the Uffizi with a queue of 2,000 Japanese and Oriental people waiting to go into the Uffizi, rather committed into temperature with a little box of Coke or Fanta in her hand, and then they walk up and they end up finally in front of the Primavera of Botticelli, which has a great protective glass, so thick that you don't see the Primavera anymore, and you have 200 people with their hands lifted up because they're taking a photo with a smartphone. They don't see anything. They went to Firenze, they had an experience, they saw the building outside, but the relation between them and Botticelli is almost close to zero. So we thought by that time, wouldn't it be much better to invent a different concept, which is the concept of the Museo Diffuso, which exists only in Italy, the diffused museum. You go to a lost place somewhere on a column in Tuscany. You go in another lost place somewhere up in the vineyards of the Venetian region. You can end up in Sicily, in a city wonderful like Trapani. And every time you can have a wonderful experience. Because it's not by looking at 200 paintings in an afternoon that your culture is changing. It is looking at the landscape. It is looking at the building in a landscape. It is going to the trattoria, which exalts that landscape with a wine which has the same taste as the landscape. And after that, you end up in the church and you see the Fondo Oro and you understand the Fondo Oro. You have to take one piece at a time, and taking one piece at a time, you understand much more than running crazily around from the morning to the evening with your feet blown up, with a jacket too heavy, and with the difficulty to find a Coke to drink. So, what does that mean? Can we imagine a different way to enter into contact with the legacy? I think so. After those discussions about the Museo Diffuso with my friend Paolini, I invented another one with another friend of mine who stays in Piedmont and who invented slow food. Try to eat slowly. Don't eat fast. Don't eat too much. Try to understand what you are eating. Carlin Petrini invented the idea of slow food. So combining my two friends, Antonio Paolucci and Petrini, I thought that we could invent a new idea of tourism, which is slow tourism. Wouldn't it be beautiful to invent a place in which you go to somewhere, you see two things only, you try to appreciate them. You don't see them in an horizontal way where everything has the same value. You go down deep into the question. You smell the flavor. You understand the poetic value. You try to find relations between what you have seen, what you have eaten, what you are smelling, the landscape, and the atmosphere. That would be a different idea of receiving today a relation to our legacy. And in that sense, it would help a lot Italy. And in that sense, it is a question that we can think about in a very serious way today after coronavirus. I hope that the pandemic is going to end as soon as possible, but I know that normally after similar dramas, society to change. The society changed after the great Black pest in the 14th century. Society changed after the pest of Milan in the 17th century. Society changed after World War I, not because of the end of the world, but because of the end of the Spanish flu. Great pandemics change the mind of people. We have to think today, in which way do we want to change our mind within 1 year when the question is going to be over? Probably by discovering a different relation between us, the legacy, and the inheritance, by finding a different way of perception, a different way of consuming things, and a different way to travel. Probably inventing slow tourism would make sense. And it is one of the ways that we have to think about to come back to a different relation between the past and the present. One point more. In the times of Cardinal Federico and the pest of Manzoni, you had to be closed at home, but you didn't have internet. We didn't make the call conference we are making today. We live in a different reality. We are closed. I'm staying at home. I didn't go out of my home for 2 months. But I've been in contact with televisions, I've been in contact with other people, I've been writing, I've been phoning, I've been with lots of things. We are not isolated anymore. We live a different reality. Now, in this different reality, I think even the trip through slow tourism in the Museo Diffuso can be completely different than it used to be before, because we can prepare ourselves. We can watch before going to the place where the place is. We Google, we know. I'm Googling in Indonesia in this period. I'm watching from the sky. I'm watching down to the cities. I think that people can watch the Angkor Wat, Cambodia. You can go wherever you want. So why don't you go to Italy? Why don't we come back to our country? Why don't you try to discover that wonderful thing which is the Museo Diffuso, in which we find another reality, yes, the reality of slow tourism. Now, I think that is an acceptable introduction to the argument. And if there are any questions, I'm ready to give you any sort of answer if I'm able to do it.